The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, or as most people know him, H.P. Lovecraft, was an horror author that probably a lot of people today are familiar with, at least by name, and some of his otherworldly creations. I have been a long-term fan of Lovecraft myself, picking up the omnibus novel collection series when I was about 12, and I never really stopped reading his work. Lovecraft had a big influence on pop culture, such as video games, tabletop games, movies, and music, and often without people actually realizing it. And he has always been that guy in the shadow that never really got any credit for a lot of his stuff until later, namely About Now. But as much as we know how he looks like and his mythos creations like Cthulhu and the Necronomicon, who was he actually? In this two-part video, I'm gonna go through his life and his works and discuss a little bit of who he was. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born August 20, 1890 in his family home at 194 Angel Street in Providence, Rhode Island. He was the only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft. His father was a traveling salesman dealing in jewels and precious metals and kept the family fed through that job. However, in 1893, when Howard was about 3 years old, Winfield fell into a catatonic state and was admitted to the Butler Hospital, Providence Psychiatric Institution. He was never released from the institution and eventually died of untreated syphilis in 1898 when Howard was only 8 years old. Widowed at the age of 40, Sarah Susan Phillips never really recovered from the loss of her husband. Facing this trauma, Howard and his mother moved to the mansion of his maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. His maternal aunts Lillian Delora Phillips and Annie Emmeline Phillips also lived at the estate. Being traumatized from the loss of her husband, Sarah Susan Phillips was never able to comfort Howard, so he sought comfort from the books that his grandfather had in his attic. Those books were mostly ghost stories and other gothic horror. His grandfather especially took interest in how Howard did recite poetry at a young age of 3, and how he wrote poems at the age of 6, and saw an opportunity to spark further interest into the written word. In order to do so, he gave Howard the books 1001 Nights, Age of Fable by Thomas Bulfinch, and a children's version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He also insisted Howard to write his own horror stories to keep this afloat. Sadly, these 5 years was the closest that Howard ever got to a normal, comfortable life. His grandfather sadly passed away March 28, 1904, when Lovecraft was 13 years old, and his death came to affect the lives of the remaining Phillips greatly. Being forced into poverty and forced to move from the mansion in the shadow of financial setback, Howard lost his grandfather's library and was forced to live in a cramped apartment with his mother. Without his grandfather being there to protect him, his mother's abusive, overprotective behavior escalated rather quickly, and she would often verbally abuse Howard, calling him disfigured, a freak, and switching this with overprotectiveness and love for her son. Living in a claustrophobic, unpredictable environment without knowing what was true or not, as often with abusive relationships, Howard started to believe some of his mother's word. Howard was sickly a lot in his school year, which meant he missed a lot of his school and eventually missed his graduation. However, if he really was sickly or not, we will never really know, since this might also be a part of his mother protecting him from the outside world, preventing him to venture outside of home. Lovecraft did eventually stop writing again. Despite having a suffocating relationship with his mother, he drew inspiration from the night terrors and the probable sleep paralysis he suffered from himself. He wrote a poem called Night Gaunts that is debated if it is or not, but it seems to be about sleep paralysis and how these night gaunts come at night, horrible, faceless creatures of the night. His first ever publication was a short story in The Alchemist in the United Amateur, issue number 4 in November 1916, and he continuously published short stories throughout the years while living with his mother. And some of my favorites was actually published during this time, namely The Beast in the Cave, published in the Vagrant issue number 7, June 1918, and Dagon, published in November 1919 in the Vagrant issue number 11, and The Statement of Randolph Carter, a must-read by the way, was published in the Vagrant number 13, May 1920. Eventually, his mother did snap in 1919 and was admitted to the Butler Hospital just as her late husband, and she never came out but died May 24, 1921 by complications from a gallbladder surgery. A couple of days after his mother passing, Lovecraft ventured to Boston to attend a convention for amateur journalists, at which he befriended his future wife Sonja Green, a widow that had a successful business selling hats. She, being roughly 7 years older than Lovecraft, of course made his aunts disapprove of the relationship. During this time, Lovecraft did publish his first commercial novel, namely Herbert West's Re-Animator. It ran in the homebrew publication through February to June, and Lovecraft was paid about $5 per installment of the novel. However, Lovecraft was not really happy with the work, but it brought in money that he desperately needed, and he also disliked the fact that he had to end every installment of the issue with a cliffhanger, something that Lovecraft never did prior or after this, and well, it's not his best novel actually, far from it. However, it is, to my knowledge, the first time zombies was depicted as scientifically reanimated corpses, unless you're counting Frankenstein's monster here, which we aren't, because that's not really the definition of a zombie, more of a monster creation. Lovecraft and Sonja Green did eventually marry March 3, 1924, and moved to her home in 793 Flatbush Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. They moved there because she felt that Lovecraft needed to leave his secure place of Providence in order to really hit it off with his writing, and she was willing to support him financially while working on his stories. In the beginning, he was really thrilled to live in New York, and it was here in which he met several other story writers and novelists in the group unofficially named the Calum Club. The other attendees to their meetings encouraged Lovecraft to start publishing for Weird Tales, which he did, but the reviews were mixed, and some of the readership put in heavy criticism to his work, which Lovecraft didn't take lightly. But he continued to publish several short stories and novels in Weird Tales, and it seemed that eventually a lot of people started really enjoying his work. But as this is Lovecraft, misfortune once again comes knocking on the door. Not too long after the marriage, Sonja lost her business, and most of her assets disappeared. Lovecraft himself, who had been supported by his wife, did what he could to support her now, and took a lot of smaller jobs as low-level clerk. But lacking job experience meant he couldn't keep the jobs and never really advance or even make an attempt of a career anywhere. Eventually Sonja got another job, but had to relocate to Cleveland, and this job consisted of constant traveling, so Lovecraft moved to a lower class community near Red Hook in the Brooklyn Heights. Here he was eventually burgled and left only with his clothes he had on him, and it was about this time he wrote the short story The Horror at Red Hook, which was published by Weird Tales in January 1927. But already in 1926, Lovecraft grew weary on his life in New York, and his homesickness for Providence, Rhode Island once again came around, and he eventually went back to stay there to the end of his life. During this time in Providence, he started to produce a large number of short stories and successfully published many of them in Weird Tales. Some of the more well-known was Call of Cthulhu in February 1928, The Dunwich Horror in April 1929, and The Whisperer in Darkness in August 1931. And even though he was offered money for any novel he had ready publishing during that time, until his death, he eventually failed to respond to a lot of publishers' requests, even if the stories were in fact complete. One such story was the case of Charles Dexter Ward that would eventually be published by his good friends after his death. A lot of other stories never saw the light of day until his passing, when they were found. Depressed over his friend Robert E. Howard's suicide and with no income or inheritance left, Lovecraft was forced to move to smaller apartments over time, and he could barely afford food. And in early 1937 he was diagnosed with cancer in the small intestine, and he could no longer eat properly because of the constant pain, and he suffered from malnutrition as a result. His scientific side of him made him write a diary to write down notes about his disease progress. Most of his last days were spent in bathtubs filled with hot water in order to relieve him of most of his pain, and eventually, March 15, 1937, Howard Phillips Lovecraft passed away. I am Providence. Hey there, and thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more like this, and don't forget to watch my other videos. I see you guys around.